Associate Director of the Ministries of Compassion, Peace, and Justice for the Presbyterian Mission Agency. As well, she is the Director of Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, which we know is the program responsible for natural and human-caused disaster response and recovery, both in the U.S. and globally. Working with Laurie and facilitating the chat, as well as supporting the program, is Reverend Edwin Gonzalez Castillo. He serves PDA as the Associate for Latin America and the Caribbean. Edwin joined PDA in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Both these folks have deep and rich integrity. I have worked with both of them, and I'm so pleased that they are able to join us tonight for this conversation. Their experience in the church with us in times of struggle is deep and rich. And so without any ado, we're going to turn this over to Laurie, and they will tell you how we will be going through the evening.
Thanks, Susan. Susan promised she was going to tell stories about us in seminary together. So we will see if we get a chance to do that later. And it's nice to see some other longtime friends. I see Carlos Wilton is on the call as well. And we all go way back together. I'm grateful for the chance to be here, and really kind of odd that people want to take us an hour and a half out of a Sunday night to spend more time thinking about the pandemic, which is something that all of us spend, pretty much 19 hours a day thinking about already, because it's influenced everything we do in ministry. It's influenced the way we relate to our families. It's influenced the way we relate to neighbors and friends. It has dramatically changed church. It's dramatically changed the way that we do Presbyterian disaster assistance. We are in virtual mode with many of our programs, including our hosting and hospitality work camp program and our national response team, where normally if you had a disaster within your bounds, we would come and visit you and walk alongside you. And that is not at the moment a possible thing for us to do. So what I have not had much time to do, and why I was grateful for Susan's invitation, is to stop and reflect really on all of the things that have changed and all of the actions that I have had to engage, and all of the quick pivots that we've all had to do. What I thought would be full in my life was lots of spare time, because I wasn't going anywhere and I was just sitting at home in my basement working. But I think all of us have learned that we are working harder and faster and less humanely in a lot of ways than we were before, since the pandemic has hit. So this is a chance not for me to talk at you for 45 or 50 minutes, but a chance for us to sort of try to uncover some different faces and facets of the epidemic, and to think about them from the aspect of faith, to think about them from the aspect of life together, and to think about them primarily from the aspect of beloved community. I'd like to open us in prayer with a prayer from Augustine of Hippo, actually, that came to me in the middle of my preparation earlier this week. So if you would go ahead and join me in prayer, I would be very grateful. O Lord our God, let the shelter of your wings give us hope. Protect us and uphold us. You will be the support that upholds from childhood till the hair on our heads is gray. When you are our strength, we are strong. But when our strength is our own, we are weak. In you, our good abides forever. And when we turn away from it, we turn to evil. Let us come home at last to you, O Lord, for fear that we will be lost. For in you our good abides, and it has no blemish, since it is yourself. Nor do we fear that there is no home to which we can return. We fell from it. but our home is your eternity, and it does not fall because we are away. Amen. I see that my companion is going to jump my screen around and try to make me nervous. That's what we do as disaster responders. We try to jiggle each other a little bit. So we're trying to juggle, making sure you all can see the pieces of work we have to share with you, but also that we get to see one another as well. I convened a conversation with several of my colleagues in Presbyterian Disaster Assistance a couple weeks ago and said, you know, I'm doing this thing with Synod of the Trinity on the beloved community and pandemic, and none of us have had a time to sit and talk together about this. So I wonder, what are your thinkings about this? What are your ponderings? What are your musings as we consider these things together? So as we talked, the largest thing that came out of our conversation was the sense of what it might be like for us if this were the only way we knew one another. And that caused me to start thinking about a place within the bounds of your synod, the Green Bank in West Virginia, which is in the National Radio Quiet Zone. I'm not even sure where in West Virginia it is. I just know that in that place, because there is a very, very large radio telescope array that is tuned in very fine ways to try to pick up radio signals from other places, that it is a place where they have restricted severely the use of technology. I listened to a story a few weeks ago on National Public Radio about this, and as they discussed it, they were saying that that in that area, the only radio programs are ones that are on such a low, thank you, Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Appreciate that, Maureen. That in that area, it's mostly still phone booths and dial-up phones and radio stations that operate on such a low frequency that they don't interfere with the array or with the telescope. And I got to thinking about what COVID must be like for them. Without the same sort of range of Zoom and technology and Wi-Fi and internet that the rest of us found ourselves turning to early in March, late in February. And that caused me to shift to thinking about what it's like to be part of a faith, a beloved community that is deeply centered in embodiment. Jesus became human. Jesus was God and embodied himself in human form and came to live among us. That is the core affirmation of our faith about Jesus. And in it, we think about the fact that how we know God through Jesus is in human form. So important is that human form that our two sacraments, the sacrament of baptism and the sacrament of the Eucharist, are both also embodied, not spiritual sacraments. In baptism, we welcome a child, an adult, a baby into the family of faith by the touch of water or the immersion of the body in water, symbolizing both death and birth. And in the Eucharist, we break bread and we share the cup and we gather physically at a table. What is it like to be a two-dimensional people, a people who see each other in little Brady boxes on a screen and not to know one another very long, or at least very much these days, as embodied people? So the first movement of our consideration of the beloved community and the pandemic is disruption. We who are part of an embodied religion have become, in a sense, lepers, people who stay 6 feet away from each other, people who try not to breathe on each other, people who give warning if we're coming into someone's physical space, people who do not touch, people who cannot touch, people who remain in isolation. So much of what makes us beloved, at least in my 30 years of pastoral ministry and now in the travel and connection that I have as the the director of Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, is embodiment. It's walking alongside people in their context after disaster. It's hugging people when we gather at church. It's gathering to watch people change their lives through embodied acts of protest, embodied acts of engagement in community, embodied acts like farming or animal husbandry or singing together or sharing the bread and the cup. So we have entered this space of disruption, this space in which how we knew ourselves, what we knew, what constituted our nature as a beloved community has distanced itself both from us physically and sometimes, I think, deeply in our spirits. This is an invitation for us to think about this, but also an invitation to lament. In a minute or two, I'm going to ask, actually right now, I am going to ask Edwin if he'd cue up Lisa's video. And as he's doing that, I'd like to share with you that you're going to see a couple of short videos this evening that are part of an Advent study that Presbyterian Disaster Assistance began to put together early this year. We have on our staff a very gifted documentary filmmaker who has told a bunch of different stories through the medium of documentary and film. Trigger about gun violence, Kapulahan about the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami, kind of a long-term 10-year look at one man who lost everything and rebuilt his life. Flint, the water crisis, a documentary about the poisoning of that American city. And these documentaries are now, most of them publicly available on streaming services, but also we've now tried to integrate these documentaries and small pieces of them into an Advent study that, that intersects the stories of the biblical witness during Advent with the questions that we have for our lives and with little snips of these films. And we're going to be releasing it next week, and look for that promo. We'll send it to the Synod, and it can be sent out by Michael and Susan. And if you are looking for something to engage in Advent, we invite you to do it. But we're sharing a little bit of it tonight because after COVID began, in addition to trying to do the work we were called to do by providing resources for communities in their own COVID work, we wanted to know how some of the communities we had accompanied were doing now that COVID had struck. And so David, our documentary filmmaker, called Lisa Horn, who is a social worker in Flint, Michigan, with whom we worked. Her work has engaged mostly the families of children who had serious lead poisoning and have had mental and other problems because of that. And Lisa very kindly offered to sort of share her reflections on how COVID has impacted this very vulnerable community. And we're going to invite you to listen to Lisa reflect on disruption and lament in this first video. And then we're going to send you into breakout rooms for a little bit of discussion time about lament and disruption.
This is truly an unprecedented situation.
This virus doesn't discriminate. It attacks everyone.
I want every American to be prepared for the hard days that lie ahead.
The coronavirus has changed life as we know it across America.
When COVID-19 hit our community, I guess the first thing I would say is I felt like we were in almost like a whirlwind.
On January 30th, Chicago witnesses the first person-to-person transmission in the country. The following day, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar makes this announcement.
I have today declared that the coronavirus presents a public health emergency in the United States.
One of the initial things was shock, kind of disbelief. Is this real? Is this really happening? We're still dealing with, the water crisis. That's not over yet. Work is still being done around getting clean water. And so now here's this next tragedy, this next potential devastation. And in the beginning, I still really did not understand the depth of what the COVID-19 was going to do to our community and communities all across this world. And when people started dying and the numbers started rising, sadness, people that I began to talk to, because as a social worker and working with people and helping people, access services, counseling them on various challenges that they're having in their lives, here's this mass pandemic that has put people in their homes and says you can't go anywhere, and the risk of you not doing that, it could be fatal. You could die. I was in disbelief. I was in shock, really in shock. And as a social worker, my heart just began to, it was saddened, and excuse me if I tear up, but my heart began to sadden because I know vulnerable populations already have challenges. And on top of this, what will happen to homebound seniors? What's going to happen with children and their parents who may have a low income or very little income? What's going to happen with our homeless population? And I began to cry out to the Lord, help. Lord, help. What do we do? Help. I don't feel like I heard an answer. Something like what has happened with COVID-19. I never thought that I would see anything like this.
In a minute, Michael's going to send us to breakout rooms, and we're going to put this question up on the screen for you to talk about with those in your breakout group. There are not going to be leaders. The only prep for this is the question we're about to show you. And this is a question that we've been using. Our Spiritual and Emotional Care Division and Presbyterian Disaster Assistance has been holding webinars on resiliency and respite retreats for presbyteries and synods since, I guess, about April of this year. And one of the questions that our spiritual director of these programs leads people into is to say, in this season of my life, I've experienced. So our question for you tonight is modeled on that one. And we invite you to share with each other, in this season of COVID, my life, my ministry, my community has experienced disruption in. So Mike, go ahead if you will, and we're going to give folk 10 minutes. You can monitor yourselves on making sure everyone gets a chance to share, and the question will be with you as you go into your rooms.
Okay, and I will share the question in the chat as well in case you forgot it. So once you're in your rooms, the question should appear in your chat.
Thanks. Welcome back, everybody. If anyone felt like what they talked about in the breakout rooms was something they'd like to share so that we can capture that, and if you have permission to do so, please feel free to put those musings or those images in the chat when you have a minute. Right now, I'd like to turn most of our attention back to what, for some of us, is a book we read just a few years after we came out of seminary. For me, it was a book that someone pointed me to after a Category 5 hurricane devastated the community in which I was serving as a new pastor. And I volunteered, like people do, to be the chair of the Hurricane Commission for the Presbytery of Tropical Florida, knowing literally nothing about hurricanes and absolutely nothing about hurricane response. And 2 years later, as we were still trying to come out from under the devastation of that storm, I was exhausted and confused, and according to my spouse and child and church members, not a very pleasant person to be around. And I couldn't really figure out what was happening to me and why what I had been taught, what I believed, what I preached, and what I tried to live was not a resource that was helping me. As I was struggling to make sense of that, a friend said, you know, you really ought to look at Walter Brueggemann's little commentary on the Psalms called The Message of the Psalms, because in it, he addresses why you feel the way you feel right now. Some of you may have read it, and if you have, I urge you to go pull it off the shelf. Some of you may not have. It's an Augsburg commentary, very small, and basically what Brueggemann did in that little commentary was, instead of taking the traditional approach to the Psalms of dividing them up into 5 different types and talking through the communal versus the individual and all of the different things, he talked about the Psalms in a sort of a post-critical way. And he said, what if the Psalms are a way of talking about human experiencing? What if the Psalms in their different expressions are a way of helping humanity and the faith community grapple with how life is? And following up on that imagining, he said he thinks the Psalms can be divided into 3 basic kinds of categories, which he understands as orientation to the world. The first category is a category he calls settled orientation. And he uses Psalm 1 to talk about it, and some other Psalms as well. But it's that place where human life consists in satisfied seasons of well-being. And if we do the right things happen to us. If we're good, God blesses us. If we're bad, God curses us. And these Psalms set up kind of a worldview that allows us to believe that our obedience or our disobedience are the measure of how life is going to be for us. It sounds simplistic when you think about it, and yet just a few years ago when my brother was killed in an accident, and shortly after that my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, all my father could say was, I've done everything right all my life. I don't understand why this is happening to me. So these Psalms of settled orientation set up kind of a backdrop worldview. And as in the last year or so, I've tried to listen more closely to my African-American theological colleagues and to the communities of protest, both Indigenous and Black and people of color. I've begun to think that settled orientation could also be described in a way as an orientation of privilege, an orientation that says the beloved community is so loved by God that God will bless that community and protect that community. And what we know and what we learn, whether it's through the confrontation of racism or the confrontation of the pandemic of COVID, or the confrontation of a tornado or a flood in West Virginia, or a hurricane, is that life is not like that for most of us. So the second grouping of Psalms that Brueggemann has are called songs of disorientation. And he says we get to those by what he called a movement of dismantling, but I call your life falling apart or your world falling apart. And we don't need to belabor what that's like. We've experienced it recently in COVID. All of us who are pastors have experienced that when trying to accompany someone who has been confronted by a loss they did not expect and did not believe they deserved. And all of us wonder and watch in the world and see how many people have life taken away from them and meaning taken away from them and power taken away from them in the blink of an eye. And that experience, as Lisa Horn just shared with us in the video, causes us to cry out to God and to wait for an answer that doesn't seem to come. The speech that comes in the season of disorientation is a speech of lament. And lament is both a personal experiencing, but also, as we'll see a little bit later tonight, kind of an action of the beloved community that is counterintuitive and that is countercultural. It's a voicing of a way the world is not and should be that very literally calls that new way of living into being. Brueggemann says that particularly for those of us, he doesn't use this word in this book, but for those of us who dwell in white privilege and who dwell in sort of dominant culture or dominating culture, as it were, that the experience of disorientation is so unpleasant and so terrifying that most of us will do whatever we can to get out of it very, very quickly. But what I would like to suggest to us tonight as we think about characteristics of the beloved community is that seasons of disorientation are opportunities. Opportunities to be persistent, opportunities to practice patience, opportunities to cry out and to dwell in a very different space than we do in the old normal in which we used to live. Faithful action for the beloved community in times like this, in seasons like this, is, I believe, not to try to wrap everything up, not to try to decide what the after is going to look like, but rather to be willing to remain present, to be willing to remain uncomfortable, to be willing to listen to difficult stories, and to be willing to not only offer a voice of lament, but to listen deeply to voices of lament that we may never have taken time to attend to before. Brueggemann's third movement we won't be getting to tonight, nor do I think we're going to be getting to it in 2020 and maybe not even in 2021, but it is a season of new orientation. Brueggemann uses Psalm 23 as one of the Psalms to talk about it. And it is an orientation in which we still have the opportunity to return to a sense of the goodness of God, the goodness of creation, the sense of belonging, the sense of being and celebrating our life as a beloved community. But it is also a sense that is tempered by our own experience of suffering, our experience of the pain and suffering of others, and our understanding that that these seasons are seasons in which we sometimes have to dwell, and that the inevitability of our painfulness in those times is something that we need to tolerate in order to move to what most people call a new normal, but which in Presbyterian disaster assistance we come to call a place of wisdom, because we're not sure there ever is a normal. And new normal also sometimes seems like it wants us to jump over the abnormal. And yet disorientation is as deeply normal as the old normal was. We just aren't used to it. And so the new normal is a place of wisdom that has built our resiliency and our persistence and our quality of forbearance, as James Calvin Davis shared with us a couple of weeks ago. That we have built those skills and those resiliencies and strengthened, therefore, the quality of our ability to be a beloved community. I'd like us to shift now to our second movement, a movement that we're going to call Apocalypse. Seasons of catastrophe, at least when we look at them on CNN, are often called apocalyptic seasons. I'm thinking about when the Beirut explosion happened about a month ago, and the people who witnessed it, who were close to downtown, talked about sort of the apocalyptic nature of the shattering of buildings and windows and the fire and the mushroom cloud. And many people have said the same about the fires in the West. And we use the word apocalypse to describe in another way the impact and the feeling of what catastrophe does to us. Back when I was still a pastor, but also serving as a volunteer for Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, I had the opportunity to be invited to go to New York City after September 11th and to craft a retreat in which the pastors of New York City and Long Island Presbytery could come together and ponder and pray and think about the impact of that event on their lives and their ministries. One of the pastors who attended that, his name is Mark Greiner. He now lives in the DC area. Some of you may know him. Mark wrote me about 4 months after this retreat and said, you know, I've been thinking a lot about September 11th and about the whole idea of recovery. Because when we're in the middle of something and when we've had something happen, all everybody wants to talk about is recovery. He said, so as it happened, even as my congregation was dealing with the death of many of our members who were firefighters, and we were all going to funeral after funeral after funeral, he said, I also was having a struggle with an autoimmune disease and trying to figure out what recovery would look like. He said, so I went to the Bible and I started looking for a word study, and I tried to find a word in the Bible for recovery. He says, but it was strange. I really couldn't find a word for recovery. But what I did find was a different word. I found a word, apocalypse. And when I broke that word down into its parts in Greek, the word apocalypse is apocalypto, which interestingly enough doesn't mean recovery, but means uncovering. And Mark began to go on and ponder. He said, what is the meaning that is uncovered in apocalypse? If we study the book of Revelation and think about how the book of Revelation unfolded in a world where the Roman Empire's reach was beginning to crumble at the edges, and all of that overlay of empire was beginning to collapse, what was being uncovered in the lives of the people and the communities that Rome had controlled for so long? And the apocalypse of John, or the revelation of John, is an opportunity for the church to uncover what is really going on beneath. So Mark Greiner said that his work going forward as a pastor and as a human being was not to cover up or to recover, but rather to take the opportunity in the middle of disruption to uncover and to look under the edges of what had happened and to try to discern what was being revealed, what was being seen. So let's take a minute and look at what is being seen and what is being uncovered by the pandemic. Globally, 40 million cases have been reported from 215 countries. So that means there are probably far more than 40 million from places that are not reporting. And 1.1 million globally have died to date. I rechecked the numbers today. In the US, over 8 million people are infected, and deaths are standing about now around 220,000. What is being uncovered is that the experience we're now going through is showing not just a human cost in families of our own knowing, but what is being uncovered is how fragile our systems are globally and here in the United States. The number of people facing acute food insecurity is expected to rise to 265 million because of COVID-19 in 2020, which is almost a doubling of the number of people who live in acute food insecurity at this point. This is happening in a context of nearly 690 million people remaining hungry every day and night, and an additional 2 billion people, which is about 20%, 26% of the world population, who experience moderate hunger and moderate severe levels of food insecurity. COVID-19 is adding burden to about 1.8 billion people who have to depend on a source of drinking water that is not pure, that may be contaminated by fecal material or by industrial waste, or may be in a place where water is only an episodic opportunity. We found this when we were doing a series of grants right after COVID hit, that about a third of the grants that we processed internationally, and most of those that we processed in Africa and a lot of the ones in Latin America, had to do with the lack of water for sanitization. People did not have clean water, even to drink or to bathe in. So how are they supposed to be able to wash their hands in order not to get infected? So what COVID is showing us is that the world we thought we were building, a world that at least the UN would like to believe is guided by the Sustainable Development Goals, is actually far more vulnerable for water, far more vulnerable for food security, far more vulnerable in terms of violence against women and girls globally, far more vulnerable in terms of development. And the imposition of the burden of COVID on top of those vulnerabilities is uncovering how very, very fragile most of the world is. In the United States, we see how the stimulus funds that were released and the increased provision of unemployment resources were sort of a short-term fix, but they did more in the end for larger employers and for people who had job security than they did for the vast numbers of people who are part of the gig economy or part of the informal labor pool, as they say. And so we see how our system of economics and the way we do jobs and job security and the way we resist sort of a base level of income brings vulnerability during a pandemic, and additionally causes people who may be sick to have to work because otherwise they will not eat, and they will lose their houses, and they will lose their security. The closure of schools during the pandemic has shown a level of privilege in our society that most of us take for granted. I'm lucky enough to be affluent enough to be able to complain about being on Zoom all day. But I know people, and I know you do too, for whom the opportunity to have enough computers in the house and a strong enough Wi-Fi signal, and teachers who are willing and able to do non-traditional instruction is a gift and not an entitlement. Children who are already vulnerable in our United States school system are not going to be moving ahead at the same rate. All of us are going to suffer, but the children of the poor, the children of indigenous people who live on reservations where there is not enough internet are going to be doing much, much worse. And what this pandemic is showing us and uncovering for us is that technology is really, in a lot of ways, a function of privilege and not a function that is applied in an egalitarian way in our society. I actually wrote down 5 or 6 pages of things that this pandemic is showing us and uncovering for us. But Edwin is going to take over for a few minutes and talk about this from the international perspective and from the perspective of a statement that most of us have heard several times. We're all in the same boat and we're all in this together. Edwin.
Hi, everyone. Yes, after this pandemic started, one of the things that was repeated constantly was that we are all in the same boat. We are all in the same boat, and we are facing the same issues, and we are all in this together. Well, the reality is that it's not that the same boat. And this is an illustration that I wanted to show you. It's an illustration done by Barbara Keeley, and it was to accompany a quote from Dr. Alan Lightman that says that we are not all in the same boat. We are all in the same storm, but some of us are in a super yacht, and some of us are in a draft or a small piece of wood. And that is the reality that we have been seeing all over the world and here in the United States, is that it's not the same what many people are facing. It's not the same issues. And when we talk about the situation in Latin America and internationally, when we talk about with our partners about what they're facing, it is amazing that it's not the same conversations. They're not having the same issues. For us here in the United States, a lot of people are talking, oh, this having to be in Zoom and having to be on meetings online and not being able to go to the mall or go to a restaurant. Those are not the issues that many people in the United States and international are facing. The reality is a lot different for them. And even in places in Latin America, I got to see the way some of our partners have been responding to the coronavirus issue. And one of my conversations and one of the pictures I received is from one of our churches in Honduras. And this is the picture that they sent me. I don't know if you're seeing it, a donkey. This is how in Honduras, they have been delivering food to the communities in many areas. And it's quite different from what we have seen, for example, in Puerto Rico, even in my country, this is how they deliver food. It's a big truck. It's a lot of food for a lot of people, but that's not the reality in many other countries in Latin America and in the world, where access to even an auto or a truck is not a possibility, or it's even more money to spend doing that to get food for the communities. So when we talk about the situation, sometimes we think that our situation is the same situation that everyone is confronting. Sometimes we think that my challenges is everyone else's challenges, but sometimes we discover that our challenges are not really that big compared to what some people in the United States and in other places in the world are suffering. When we have conversations to them and they talk about having to walk 5-6 times a day to get water to be able to cook or to clean or to drink because the well is far away, and that the closest well is the water is too salty. When they talk about the issues about how you can talk about with your family about masks when you have never seen a mask because it's not something accessible to you in your communities. When we talk about cleaning your hands and washing, and when something as simple as soap is not that feasible or acquirable in many of our countries because it's expensive, and sometimes you have to choose between cleaning, between sanitary, or eating that day. So it's quite amazing what we have discovered in the middle of these conversations with partners all around the world, that yet the reality is we're not in the same boat, and we need to be knowledgeable of that, because at the same time that makes us look around us and see who is suffering and how they are suffering. Laurie.
Thanks, Edwin. We are the beloved community. And even as we are experiencing our own senses of loss and disconnect, because we are the beloved community, we're willing to listen to the stories of others and to accompany others. And so the work of apocalypse, the work of uncovering, is something that we are invited to do, because Jesus was one who walked alongside the poor and listened to their stories. So we'd like to take just a minute as we transition to the next phase of Lament, and invite all of you to put in the chat, just take a minute and think about your own town, your own community, your own state. What has been uncovered that you didn't know about the community in which you serve, about the people that live in that community? What has been uncovered because of COVID that you, as a member of the beloved community, are willing to pay attention to and to notice? Let's take a few minutes, couple minutes, and type in the chat. Mm. Mm. As we move to our next place, I'll invite you to keep thinking about what has been uncovered in your context and pop it into the chat as and when you will. I would like to talk a little bit now about lament as resistance. Cornel West once said, justice is what love looks like in public. So as participants in the beloved community, lamenting the effect of the pandemic in our midst and lamenting what has been, some of what has been uncovered, because as you've noted, many things that have been uncovered are also strengths and gifts that are resources for us. It's important for us to take a minute and think about this other function of lament. When we lament, oh good, there's good, thank you. When we offer a voice of lament, we're not only grieving what is no longer part of our life, but we are also giving voice to the reality that life is not supposed to be like this. I believe that this is a thing that we are only able to do because we have been given the vision of a kingdom that God wants us to live in. The kingdom that Jesus proclaimed was already in our midst and was coming, and that he invited us to participate in by following him and by doing as he did, and by being the community of faith in the beloved community. Every time that we lament a reality that isn't as it should be, a wrong that we know should not be allowed to persist, or a hurt that is beyond bearing, we are not only offering sorrow, but we are offering the power of our sorrow in the service of the world. I tried to remember what the book was and I couldn't find it, but I do remember the quote. Dorothy Soleil, the German theologian who wrote a great deal about peace and who wrote after World War II in Germany, wrote a book in which she told a number of stories, and these stories were a way of articulating different theological ideas. And one of the stories that she told was about going to school one morning and watching three bigger boys torment and beat up a very small child for the purpose of stealing his bicycle. And she felt, she said that as she watched that and realized that she was by herself too powerless to stop these bullies from beating up this little boy, she realized that that she was sick to her stomach. And she said, injustice or justice is a feeling of rage in the pit of your stomach. In the New Testament, Jesus, in some of his healing stories, actually only in one or two, there's one in, I believe, the Gospel of Mark, where when the person who wants to be healed comes to Jesus and says, "You can make me whole," Jesus looks at him, and the story says, the text says that he was twisted with compassion. The word in Greek is splanchnizomai. And it gets translated usually as compassion, but what it means is that Jesus was literally made sick to his stomach. He was enraged, he was heartbroken, he was saddened, he was revolted, he was so torn up internally by the suffering of this person that he quite literally could do nothing other than to act to save that person, to heal that person, to bring that person to newness of life. So for us, even as we grapple with our own small or large brokenness in the midst of pandemic, in the midst of COVID, we have the opportunity as the beloved community to let our lament be something that changes us and makes us unwilling to settle for anything less than Christ's vision of the kingdom of God. And we can take that compassion, that twisting of our spirit to empower us to walk alongside people, which is really what we've been trying to do in the work that we've been doing. Actually, the work that we've been watching all of you do. PDA did take some money out of reserves in order to put grant money in the hands of people in the United States, and also grant money in the hands of our international partners. And usually, at least in the United States, this is one of those uncovering things. If you have a disaster, we're going to call you up and say, you've had a disaster. Carl Wilton knows this because he went through Hurricane Sandy, Super Typhoon Sandy. We're going to call up and say, here are some things that are there to be done, but what would you like to do? And where would you like to do it? And we'll try to bring both the resources and the skill set to help you. But as we engaged pandemic a few months ago, people from communities of color, pastoral leaders from indigenous communities, African-American pastoral leaders came to us and said, you need to listen to what it's like in our churches and for our communities. And we need you to take seriously how important it is that these resources are available to us as well as to the whole church. And so in listening to those stories, rather than coming to our grant programs just saying, here's some money, do whatever you want, we reached out to synods and to presbyteries and to congregations and said, please listen deeply with the compassion of your church, with the compassion of your hearts to your neighbors, and see who in your midst is vulnerable, see who in your midst is going to be systemically left out of the recovery, see who has nowhere else to turn except to you to get what they need to survive this pandemic. And we were stunned and deeply moved and really transformed as we watched grant request after grant request come in, not from churches saying, we don't have enough money to pay the bills, but rather churches saying, we don't have enough money to pay the bills, but you know what? We have a food bank. Would you help us deepen our outreach with our food bank? Would you help us with our community garden? There's a refugee community down the street. They don't have anything. Is it okay if we give the money to them? People who, in the midst of their own anxiety, let their compassion be broken open and were transformed by that, and use the resources of the church, which are really the resources that the church has given us to give back in ways that that showed resistance to the way the world is and the way the structural inequities in our world are, and showed the power of the beloved community reaching out in compassion. We are going to now show another brief clip of Lisa. Lisa Horn from Flint, talking about her own experience of lament and resistance, and then Edwin's going to talk a little bit about International Ministry of Presence, and then we're going to wrap up.
When COVID-19 hit, you begin to think about the toll that it's going to take on a community that has already dealt with multiple devastation over years. The thought is, what are we going to do? And I think when we talk about identity, is that when things get tough, we know how to get tougher because we've had some practice, we've had some experience as a community. And so being able to come together and collaborate and discuss how we are going to work together to get this done, it's almost like so many territorial kind of behaviors just go away and people come together and say, okay, we got to get this done. That has been a remarkable thing about Flint and Genesee County. The care and concern about the people here by the people who are here, it really is amazing, and it really is commendable. We talk about being strong, we talk about being fighters, we talk about being overcomers, we talk about being resilient. That's part of the identity of this community. Our community has been forced to work together in so many different times with so many different layers that we have a way of connecting that I think is, I'm not going to say it doesn't happen anywhere else, but it's definitely unique. We are going to address the needs of the people. We are going to come together. We're going to build resources. We're going to collaborate. We're going to educate. We're going to support one another.
There's a quote from a writer called Leonardo Boff. He wrote a book called The Cry of the Earth, The Cry of the Poor. And there's a beautiful quote that I always remember when talking about the need of the church to hear the cry of the people. And I want to share with you in a moment. It says, when the poor cry for life and justice and are not heard by the churches, as happens in so many places in the third and fourth world, then this amnesia becomes blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. And he dedicates a little bit about talking about that, about the importance for the church to hear out the cry of the people. That part of us as being church is also to listen to the voices, and sometimes to give voice to those who are whose voice has been taken off by society. And part of what we have done in PDA for the past almost 8 months now is sit down and listen and have conversations with our partners and try to understand. Most of the time in situations before, we got to be able to travel and see firsthand what was happening in many of the disaster situations. But in this case, because of the ban of traveling and many other issues, we needed to have conversations where we had to try to understand the situation of the people just by listening to them. And I remember one of the conversations that has struck me, and I'm always reminded of it, was with the pastor from the church that I mentioned before, from Honduras, Juan Rodas. And I remember that after that conversation, I started crying, and in his conversation, and whenever I share that story after that, I started crying, and I mentioned to people, and he was crying when he told me his story. And the interesting thing was that he was telling me a story about someone in his community who was crying and telling him the story. So it became a circle of people crying by sharing their stories, by sharing their pains, by sharing their situation. And when I see the work of PDA, when I see the work of the church, sometimes even in the distance, that's what people need, to be heard, to be able to understand, to feel, and that other people are understanding and are there to listen to them, and they're sharing their own pain, and they're sharing their situation. And since then, I have never seen in my life Juan Rodas. It has been one of those new partners that we have established context through Hunger Program, and we talk all the time through WhatsApp, one of the apps that we use a lot in Latin America. And every time I talk, I ask him about that community and that family that he mentioned in that first conversation, and the other families. And it has been wonderful to see the changes in voice and the change in conversation from someone who in the beginning of this was losing all hope. Many of our partners didn't know where to go. And when we sent the first letter that we sent from PDA, letting them know that PDA had allocated some funds and that we wanted to partner up with them, and that we're interested in hearing what was happening in their community and how we could help them. One of the good things is that we didn't go to them and say, oh, this is what we're going to do. No. What is the needs? What is happening in your community, and how can we best respond to it? In many of our conversations with our partners, they were surprised because they really didn't know where to go. So I think as a church, in many of our communities, there's that need to be heard. There's that need to listen to the cry of the people. Because maybe like Leonardo said, if we don't, we're doing blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Laurie.
Thanks, Edwin. I'm going to ask you, Edwin, to put up the Mark text in a second. And we are now going to talk a little bit about what is the invitation of COVID to the beloved community. Disruption always brings an invitation. And to sort of frame this conversation, which is really your conversation, I want to share at least what I think is an alternative angle on a story, the first healing story from Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is hunting for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages and the cities, so that I can preach there also, for that is what I have come to do." And so he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. But a man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was clean. So Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell anything to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest. Offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." But instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. And as a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet people still came to him from everywhere. Does COVID derail the mission of the church? Or is it an invitation, a disruption, that's inviting us to look in a different way? This text from the Gospel of Mark, as I am viewing it these days, says that Jesus had a very clear idea of what he intended to do in his ministry. He sets that out at the beginning of this story. When his disciples finished hunting for him and found him, he said, "Let us go out to the villages and preach the good news, for that is what I have come to do." But then before he is barely on the way of that path, that mission that he has chosen, a leper comes to him and says, "If you choose, you can make me clean." And I was always caught by the notion of Jesus choosing in this text, and by the boldness of this leper living in isolation, for whom Jesus was perhaps his last desperate, miraculous hope, but who in himself had enough dignity and grace not to beg, but rather to say, "If you choose, and perhaps you may not, You can make me clean. I've been thinking about why Jesus might choose not to clean the leper. Because if the leper is cleansed, which in this story he is, Jesus' own ministry becomes dependent on what the leper chooses to do. Because the rules surrounding leprosy and cleanliness were very, very strict. Even as we are experiencing a very pale and pallid form of that now, we keep our distance, we don't go close, we wear our masks, we wash our hands. We have certain behaviors that we use to protect ourselves and others from the risk of infection. And so for Jesus, also bound by a ritual set of rules around that, for the leper to be cleansed and for Jesus to continue with the ministry he was setting himself up to do, means that the leper needs to do what he's supposed to do following his cleansing. Go to the priests, show that he's clean, get a certification, and then go back to humanity. But in this story, when people are freed, they don't necessarily do what you tell them to do. They do what they feel called to do. And that's what this leper, this former leper, chooses to do. But according to the rule of the time, if the leper chooses not to do what he's supposed to do, then who becomes unclean in his place? But Jesus, because to touch a leper is yourself to become a risk and unclean. And so Jesus finds himself sort of in a bit of a conundrum, and this is maybe a variant reading of this story, but to me, when the story ends by saying, and so Jesus was no longer able to go into the villages, it's not because there were so many people following him that he couldn't get in. It's because he has become a leper, or at least at the risk of leprosy, because the man didn't do what he was supposed to do with the priest, and therefore Jesus himself has become the same. He himself must stay on the outside of the villages. When we, and please hear that the only reason Edwin and I have been talking about our PDA work is because that's the ministry context that we have to examine COVID. And the only way that we can sort of process what COVID has meant to us as pastors and as people of faith and as part of the beloved community. But all of us have ministries in which we have a certain idea of what we were supposed to do. Parents have a certain idea of what their kids are supposed to be doing. My daughter, an opera singer, had a plan for this year that had a lot of big opportunities in it, all of which evaporated in February. And so what we have come to do has in so many ways been interrupted by COVID. And as the beloved community grapples with the impact and the cost of that, we also have this rich invitation to consider what our alternative strategies may be. Jesus was going to go to the cities and the towns, but because of his choice in engaging with the leper, the man who had leprosy, Jesus then made an alternative choice and had to stay on the outsides of the village. So our final question for you all, and maybe we won't do it in the breakout room, but we'll invite you to put it in the chat, is how are the disruptions of COVID inviting you to stop and consider an alternative pathway in ministry? And how might those choices that you are maybe thinking you're forced to make, but let's think about ourselves as agents of our own response and say we choose to make these responses and these changes. How might these choices we make to do something differently in our ministry, in our family life, and our work together because of COVID, how might these choices change how we understand the beloved community? I don't remember whether we put those on a piece of paper or on a slide, Edwin, or not, but if we did, you could put them up. A church in Arlington, Virginia wrote me in late April and said, my presbytery exec just said that the problem we're facing might be something that you'd like to help us with. And he went on to describe how he was, how their cafe, they used to have a neighborhood cafe, had to be shut down because of COVID, but they didn't want to fire everybody, so they kept trying to pay people, but the people weren't able to cook. And then suddenly he realized that there was also nearby the church where the cafe was, a large day laborer community, mostly people who were undocumented migrants. And he began to think, you know, if we could cook, we can't have people come into the cafe, but maybe some of these folks who no longer can do day labor and can't go in and get help from the government, or maybe afraid to get help from the government, maybe we could provide food for them, and then we could keep the farmers, the small farmers that we've been buying from, with some income. We can keep these young adults and these people who have just come out of incarceration who are cooking for us employed, and maybe we can provide some meals, and all we really need is some startup money for that so that we can switch from one way of doing our ministry to another. And so with a very small grant, this congregation reopened their cafe, fed 2 meals a day to 150 families of undocumented day laborers who were right around the outsides of Arlington, Virginia. And the ministry of that church, the ministry of that cafe, the ministry of those young people and those farmers and those family members of the church will be changed forever because of reforming the beloved community in that way. So when Susan asked me to do this, I said, I have never done anything like this before. And we both thank you for your patience and your tolerance with us. And we hope that the questions we've raised around what it means will be questions you'll continue to engage with, and would invite you to share those with us, because we are not in the aftermath, we are in the midst. And so the learning that we do is a learning that we are called to do together, and to keep, what is the term? Reforming and always being reformed. So thank you for being with us. And I don't know what you want to do, Michael and Susan. I know we're kind of at time, and but we're willing, Edwin and I can stay on a little bit if people are.
So let me suggest this. Let me suggest this, Laurie and Edwin, and I am I'm pondering. You set us into a pretty heavy space there as we're moving towards closing. So what I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, is to pray the prayer that you have printed on your docket for us. And if folks have questions, after we pray, folks are free to leave. If you have questions you want to put in the chat, we can stay for a few more minutes. But Edwin and Laurie, I thank you so very much. Your tone has been restful for us. And that is a wonderful gift in these days. And so let us pray. And then if there are no questions, it's okay. You don't have to, I know that we've been given some pretty heavy duty stuff this Sunday evening, and it is a good thing. And it is a challenge to us to reframe and reform our call to beloved community. So let us pray. May our eyes remain open even in the face of tragedy. May we not become disheartened. May we find in the dissolution of our apathy and denial the cup of the broken heart. May we discover the gift of the fire burning in the inner chamber of our being, burning great and bright enough to transform any poison. May we offer the power of our sorrow to the service of something greater than ourselves. May we endure. May sorrow bond us and not separate us. May we realize the greatness of our sorrow and not run from its touch or its flame. May we not be afraid to see or speak our truth. May the bleakness of the wasteland be dispelled. And may the soul's journey be revealed and the true hunger fed. May we be forgiven for what we have forgotten and blessed with the remembrance of who we really are. Amen. And that's from the Terma Collective. And where is that, Laura?
I've never been able to find out much information about them. That prayer I got from a book, a collection called Prayers from Around the World and Earth Prayers. And it's in a collection of multi-faith prayers. And every time I Google the Terma Collective, I don't get very much. So whoever they are, that is how I feel about the work that I do and the work that the beloved community does in times like these.
Yes, I will send a prayer out. It's being asked for. Thank you. It was wonderful. Are there any questions? Edwin, you're back on if there are questions for you to field. And if not, friends, have a wonderful rest of evening. Hyperpartisanship is next Sunday evening with John Welch. Right.
You really know how to have fun on a Sunday evening. You Sinner the Trinity people. Bless you.
Yeah, we do. The recording will be available within a day or two, Doug.